Welcome to The Clue Cafe, where mysteries brew and every detail matters. I'm thrilled to have you here. Whether you're a lifelong detective fiction fan or just love a good puzzle, you've found the right place. Before we dive into today's mystery, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? I'd love to see how far our curious community reaches. Chapter 1. A Visitor in the Fog, from the journals of Dr. John H. Watson. It was a damp and bone-chilling November afternoon when the curious incident that came to be known as the Adventure of the Vanishing Violin first made its presence known at 221 B Baker Street. The fire in our hearth had long since been reduced to a soft, sighing glow, and the grey light of a smog-laden sky filtered lazily through the sooty windows, casting our sitting room in a melancholic half-shadow. I had just returned from a particularly wearisome morning at the surgery, and Holmes, who had passed the better part of the day in a state of exaggerated languor, sat sprawled upon the sofa in a robe that had once been burgundy and now bore the unmistakable hue of disuse and pipe ash. He had neither stirred nor spoken for over an hour, save for the occasional grunt as he tamped the bowl of his meerschaum pipe or flipped a page of the Times. It was one of those stretches during which his extraordinary mind withdrew from the practical world altogether, engaging instead in what he once described to me as the silent calculus of possibilities, a retreat I had come to accept as a necessary prelude to some impending intellectual tempest. Our shared silence was broken at last by a crisp series of raps at the front door, 3 short, then 1 long and another short. Mrs. Hudson's muffled voice echoed up the stairwell, and a moment later we heard the front door open. "Ah," Holmes said, as if remarking upon the arrival of an expected parcel. "That is the step of a man both hesitant and hurried. His boots are of fine make but recently muddied, which speaks to haste across rough ground, perhaps Hyde Park. And listen, the faint jingle of metal, keys, no doubt, not in a servant's pocket but too many for a casual visitor. Interesting. Holmes," I said, amused despite myself, "do give the poor fellow a chance to reach the landing before you write his biography." He only smiled faintly. "I merely note what is plain to anyone whose faculties have not been dulled by domestic routine." The knock came again, this time at our own door. "Enter," Holmes called lazily. The door creaked open and admitted a tall man in his early 40s, wrapped tightly in a black overcoat, from which the remnants of London's afternoon fog still clung like ghostly cobwebs. His cheeks were pale, his expression drawn, and his gloved hands shook faintly as he removed his hat. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" "I am," Holmes replied, rising at last from his repose. "And you, sir, are in urgent distress. Pray, do take a seat. This is my friend and associate, Dr. John Watson." I stepped forward to shake his hand, which was cold and damp despite the warmth of our room. I offered him a glass of brandy, which he accepted with murmured thanks. Once he had taken a few sips, some of the colour returned to his face, and he leaned forward in his chair. "My name is Victor Hargrave," he began. "I was the first violinist of the Harrington Ensemble." "A string quartet of considerable repute," Holmes interrupted. "I recall reading a favourable review of your recent performance in the Evening Standard." Hargrave nodded tightly. "We performed last night at the Royal Lyceum. It was a sold-out event. Nothing seemed amiss at first, but during the interval I returned to my dressing room to find my violin missing." "A distressing loss," Holmes said. "It was not just any violin," Hargrave said, his voice cracking slightly. "It was a Stradivarius, passed down through 4 generations of my family. It has been my sole companion on every stage I have stood upon." Holmes's expression grew sharp. He leaned forward. "Describe the circumstances precisely." I had performed the opening set, Brahms' string quartet in a minor. After our bow, I retired briefly to my dressing room, which I had locked earlier. When I unlocked it and stepped inside, the violin case was gone. Was the room disturbed? Hardly. A chair was askew, which I thought odd, but nothing else appeared touched. My personal effects were untouched. No sign of a break-in, no damage to the door or windows, and only 3 others had keys to that room. Our conductor, Charles Fenwick, our cellist, Miss Lydia Marston, and the theatre's stage manager, Bernard Quayle. Holmes steepled his fingers. Fascinating. No sound heard during the performance. None that I noticed, though the backstage area is seldom quiet. Moving props, adjusting lights, the usual bustle. Holmes stood and began to pace slowly. You suspect someone known to you? Hargrave hesitated. I don't know what to think. I cannot believe any of them would betray me. But it seems impossible that an outsider could have gained access. Holmes turned suddenly. You are unmarried? I am, though I share rooms in Kensington with my cousin, Lionel Hargrave. He was not at the concert. And no recent quarrels? Disputes over ownership or performance rights? Hargrave blinked. Nothing of the sort. Holmes walked to the window and peered out at the mist still swirling in the street. A locked room, a priceless instrument, a theft committed in the span of no more than 20 minutes, no forced entry, no noise, and the culprit had both knowledge of the layout and the confidence to act swiftly. He turned back, his gaze sharp. You say only 3 others had keys. Who among them would benefit most from the instrument's absence? Hargrave looked troubled. None. If anything, the loss jeopardizes the ensemble itself. We are due to record for the BBC in a fortnight. Then we must act quickly, Holmes said. Watson, we shall accompany Mr. Hargrave to the Royal Lyceum first thing tomorrow. I should like to examine the dressing room myself, before the scent grows too cold. He turned to Hargrave with sudden intensity. You must not speak of this investigation to anyone, not Fenwick, not Miss Marston, nor Mr. Quayle. I want them unaware that Sherlock Holmes is now part of this story. Hargrave nodded solemnly. And one final question, Holmes added almost as an afterthought. Do you often perform pieces by Bach? The violinist raised an eyebrow. Frequently. Why do you ask? Holmes smiled, though the smile did not reach his eyes. No reason, yet. Good night, Mr. Hargrave. We shall see you in the morning. As the door closed behind our visitor, Holmes turned to me. Watson, he said thoughtfully, we are not merely chasing a violin, we are following the first note of a composition far more elaborate. Chapter 2. The 4 Keyholders. The morning air was sharp and carried the metallic scent of distant chimneys, as Holmes and I arrived at the Royal Lyceum Theatre. The fog, though thinned by daylight, lingered like a curtain reluctantly raised. We were met at the side entrance by Mr. Victor Hargrave, who greeted us with a tight-lipped nod. His usual polish as a professional performer was dulled by anxiety and lack of sleep. Holmes's eyes moved immediately to the narrow corridor beyond, noting without comment the smudges on the skirting boards, a frayed theatre poster, and a discarded handkerchief that he nudged with the tip of his cane. This way, Hargrave said, leading us down a corridor dimly lit by skylights above. We came to a modest wooden door with a brass nameplate that read, Victor Hargrave. He produced a key and unlocked it with visible hesitation, as though expecting a ghost to confront him on the other side. The room was small but tidy, with a neatly arranged dressing table, an upright chair, and a small armoire. A thin mirror was affixed to the far wall, and beneath it lay a rug that looked recently disturbed, the corner curled awkwardly inward. Holmes entered without hesitation and crouched near the rug, lifting it gently. He he murmured. "Tell me, Hargrave, did you ever notice a faint draught in this room before?" "No," Hargrave replied, perplexed. Holmes examined the floorboards, tapping them lightly with his cane. He paused at one near the dressing table. "This one has been lifted, recently. Not forced, but with a tool meant for subtlety." He stood abruptly and turned to Hargrave. "Now then, I shall require interviews with each of the 3 key holders. Let us begin with Mr. Fenwick." Charles Fenwick, the ensemble's conductor, was found in the orchestral lounge, reading a battered volume of Goethe. He was a man of commanding height, immaculately groomed, with silver at his temples, and a voice that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. "I dare say you could have simply sent for me," he said with a faint smile as Holmes entered. "I find that rooms often speak louder than their occupants," Holmes replied smoothly. "You possess a key to Mr. Hargrave's dressing room, I believe?" "Yes, of course, all senior members do, for emergencies. But I hadn't the slightest cause to use it yesterday." "And your whereabouts during the interval?" "In rehearsal with Miss Marston. We were reviewing a tempo discrepancy in the Beethoven quartet." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Fenwick considered. "Only that Victor seemed unusually distracted before the performance. He's usually faultless, but last night he missed a cue in the second movement." Holmes gave a thin smile. "How observant of you." "I am a conductor, Mr. Holmes. Observation is my business." "Indeed. One more thing. Have you ever handled Mr. Hargrave's violin?" Fenwick shook his head. "Not once. Even among colleagues, such an instrument commands reverence." "Thank you. That will do for now." We found Miss Lydia Marston in the cello rehearsal room. She was a slender woman in her 30s with intense grey eyes and long, deft fingers that drummed nervously on her music stand as we approached. "This is all so terrible," she said, lowering her instrument. "Victor and I have played together for years. That violin was like an extension of him." "You also possess a key to his dressing room?" She nodded. "It's standard among the ensemble. We often store each other's instruments for safety during rehearsals." "And yesterday, did you use your key?" "No, I had no need." "Where were you during the interval?" "With Mr. Fenwick, discussing a change in our phrasing. He was insistent on slowing the adagio. I disagreed." "You returned to the dressing rooms afterward?" "Yes, briefly, but only to collect my coat. I saw no one else." "Did you notice the violin missing?" "No, but Victor came out a few minutes later, looking as though he'd seen a ghost. He didn't say a word until the performance resumed." Holmes nodded. "Did anything strike you as odd during the concert?" She hesitated. "He didn't play Bach. It's unusual for him not to include a solo piece, but I assumed it was a last-minute change." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Why would that choice trouble you?" She blinked. "I didn't say it troubled me, just that it was noticeable." We left her looking distinctly unsettled. Finally, we were led to the backstage office of Bernard Quayle, the theatre's long-serving stage manager. He was a blunt-featured man in shirt-sleeves, with a voice like gravel and hands that bore the oil stains of backstage labor. Holmes introduced himself, but Quayle merely grunted. "So you're the one poking about? I told Hargrave I'd bet a week's wages this was an inside job." "Indeed," Holmes said, intrigued. "And whom would you suspect?" Quayle shrugged. "Could have been a cleaner or a crew member, or someone swapped keys. You can't swing a bow backstage without knocking over a stagehand these days." "You also possess a key to Hargrave's dressing room?" "Right here." He jingled a large iron ring. "Not that I use it unless needed." "Where were you during the interval?" "In the fly gallery, fixing a jammed pulley. Ask anyone." Holmes's gaze moved across the cluttered office. A series of theatre plans hung on the wall, including a detailed cross-section of the backstage area. He moved forward and examined one of the drawings closely. "Does this ventilation shaft connect to the dressing rooms?" Quayle followed his gaze. "Technically, yes, but no one's crawled through those since gaslight was standard. Barely wide enough for a child." "Nonetheless," Holmes said, "I find its placement curious." As we left the office, I turned to Holmes. "You don't truly believe someone entered through the vents?" "Not at all, my dear Watson, but I believe someone wants us to consider it a possibility." He led me back to Hargrave's dressing room and knelt beside the small ventilation grate near the floor. He withdrew a magnifying lens and examined its edge. "Note the smudges here, left by gloved fingers. But look more closely." He handed me the lens. The edge bore faint scrape marks as though a screwdriver had been applied, but no dust had gathered inside the shaft itself. "A planted clue?" I asked. "Precisely. Someone unscrewed this grate, made a show of interference, then replaced it, just so. But they never entered or exited through it. A ruse." Holmes stood and paced slowly. 3 key holders, 3 alibis, a vanished instrument, a false point of entry, and a performance that omitted Bach. He turned to Hargrave, who stood anxiously by the door. "Mr. Hargrave, I must ask, was your program altered at any point before the concert began?" He hesitated. "Only slightly. I had intended to perform Bach's Chaconne in D minor as a solo encore, but I withdrew it that morning." "Why?" He glanced away. "I received an anonymous note. It warned me against playing Bach. It seemed absurd at the time, but now—" Holmes's voice was calm. "Where is this note?" "I burned it." A silence settled over the room. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "the thief did not merely take an object. They silenced something. The question is, what truth was to be kept from being heard?" And with that, Holmes turned sharply on his heel and strode from the room, already several bars ahead of the rest of us, in a symphony we had yet to understand. Chapter 3. The Note in the F-Hole. The following day was colder still, with the city's streets slick with recent rain, and the fog lingering like a reluctant guest. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent as we breakfasted, his fingers steepled and eyes fixed upon a single crumb on the tablecloth as if it contained the secrets of the universe. I knew better than to interrupt such contemplation. His silence meant the case had taken root, and once it had, Holmes would not rest until every last leaf had been shaken loose. "Watson," he said suddenly, setting down his cup, "do you recall what Mr. Hargrave said about the missing violin?" "Only that it was a Stradivarius, passed down through his family, and vanished without a trace." Holmes gave a dry smile. "Indeed, but there was something in the manner of his speech, an omission, rather than a statement, that troubles me. He called it his sole companion on every stage, and yet he made no mention of its specific origin or history, despite it being an heirloom. That reticence is suggestive." I frowned. "You believe he concealed something?" "I believe he neglected to tell us everything. And when a man is robbed of a priceless artifact and burns an anonymous warning note on the same day, I begin to wonder whether what was stolen was only an instrument, or a message hidden within it." Holmes rose, donned his coat and hat, and with a flick of his hand, motioned for me to follow. "We are not going to the theatre today, Watson. We are going to Kensington." The Hargrave residence stood on a quiet terrace lined with rowan trees, their berries shriveled by frost. The home was modest but well appointed, with the genteel air of faded family prestige. Victor Hargrave received us in a small parlour lit by a narrow window where a worn but elegant pianoforte stood beneath a portrait of a stern-looking woman in 18th century dress. "My great-grandmother," Hargrave said, noting Holmes's glance. "She was the first to own the violin, a gift, we believe, from a patron of the Salzburg court." Holmes smiled faintly. "So the instrument predates even your great-grandmother?" "Yes, according to our records it was made in 1713, but of course there's no maker's certificate." "And yet," Holmes murmured, "you never thought to tell me the violin once belonged to a woman of such lineage. Surely that detail might interest a thief, especially one versed in history." Hargrave flushed slightly. "I didn't think it relevant. The violin's value is in its craftsmanship, not its heritage." "That, Mr. Hargrave, is where you are mistaken." Holmes turned to examine the pianoforte. A small stack of sheet music rested on the stand, one page open to Bach's Partita No. 1. 2. Holmes ran his finger along the edge. "Did you ever perform Bach's Chaconne on this violin?" Hargrave hesitated. "Yes, often. It's my signature piece." "And the note warning you not to play it, was it typed?" "No," Hargrave replied. "It was handwritten, in block capitals, on thick paper, almost like parchment." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And still you chose to burn it?" I panicked. I didn't want to create scandal. I thought perhaps it was the work of a jealous musician." Holmes nodded, as if expecting the answer. "Tell me, did you ever look inside the violin?" Hargrave blinked. "Inside it? No, why would I?" "You've never used an inspection light or mirror to examine the body? Never noticed anything unusual in the F-holes? But why?" Holmes smiled enigmatically. "Because that is where secrets are kept, Mr. Hargrave. I suggest you think carefully. Was there ever a repair, a crack, an unusual vibration?" Hargrave looked startled. "Now that you mention it, there was a strange buzz during rehearsals last year. I sent the violin to a restorer in Geneva. He said it was nothing serious, just a loosened lining." Holmes looked at me sharply. "Watson, make a note. Geneva. A restorer with eyes perhaps too sharp for his own good." "Do you think he could have copied something?" I asked. Holmes turned to Hargrave. "Did you ever request documentation or photographs from the restorer?" Hargrave shook his head. Number Y trusted him. "A dangerous indulgence," Holmes muttered. He moved to the window and stared out. "Let us suppose for a moment that your violin was not merely a musical instrument, but a vessel, something that concealed an item of historical value. A document, perhaps, or a code, something small, light, and too dangerous to leave unguarded. The family keeps it safe by embedding it in a violin. Generations pass, and the story becomes tradition, then myth, until someone, perhaps in Geneva, rediscovers the truth." "You think the violin was taken not for its craftsmanship, but for what it contained?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Why else leave no trace? Why else issue a warning about playing a specific piece? Perhaps the vibrations of the chaconne would have loosened something best kept still." There was a long pause. Hargrave sat heavily on a nearby armchair, his hands trembling. "I don't know what to say." "Then say nothing for now," Holmes replied. "But be alert. If the thief has what they want, they may disappear entirely. If they do not, they may return." Back at Baker Street, Holmes spent the afternoon in a flurry of telegrams and reference books. He pored over violin schematics, Bach manuscripts, and several obscure volumes on musical cryptography. At one point, he held a tuning fork to his desk and tapped it sharply. "Watson, listen." A soft hum filled the room, echoing faintly off the walls. "Imagine," Holmes said, "a scroll of vellum sealed in the hollow cavity of a violin. Paper is light, resilient. It might survive a century untouched, and when the chaconne is played, particularly the sustained double stops, it could create the precise harmonic resonance to loosen such a secret. Wouldn't that risk damaging the violin? Not if it were designed to release under those very vibrations. Think of it, Watson, an instrument that sings only when the truth is ready to be heard. That evening, a telegram arrived from Geneva. Holmes tore it open and read aloud. From Herman Weltz, Luther, Geneva, to Sherlock Holmes, London. Yes, repaired. Hargrave violin last year. Discovered fragment of parchment lodged in F-hole. Ancient script. Photographed. Returned. Violin intact. Photocopy mailed separately. Parchment vanished after delivery. Holmes sat back in his chair and sighed. As I feared. They found something, I said. Yes, and someone followed the clue back to London and took the violin before its owner could rediscover its secret. What now? Holmes's eyes narrowed. Now, Watson, we lay our own bait. We shall write an open letter to the Times, praising the upcoming broadcast of Hargrave's ensemble. We shall mention, oh so subtly, that he will be resuming his signature chaconne. That should stir our thief's nerves. And if they take the bait? Holmes smiled, the thrill of the chase lighting his features. Then we catch them just before the final note. Chapter 4. Shadows Among the Seats. The morning after Holmes's letter appeared in the Times, our modest sitting room at Baker Street was visited by no fewer than 3 messengers, bearing notes of either encouragement or alarm. One from a music critic, praising the revival of Hargrave's haunting chaconne. Another from a fellow violinist, warning of bad luck attached to that Bach. And the last, unsigned, consisting solely of clipped newspaper letters pasted onto stiff card. If he plays, he dies. Holmes pinned this last specimen to the mantel with a single brass tack, gazing at it thoughtfully as he lit his pipe. The ominous message did not seem to disturb him. In fact, it seemed to invigorate his already sharpening instincts. "We are very near the heart of this mystery, Watson," he said. "The criminal's desperation betrays them. Their confidence is wavering." "You think they'll make a move before the concert?" "Unquestionably. This is the final act, and the players are assembling. The next scene may prove decisive." Holmes spent much of the day in secretive activity, dispatching telegrams to various musical institutions, theatre doormen, and even a diplomatic office in Vienna. I was not privy to the exact nature of his inquiries, but I could tell from the gleam in his eyes that he was drawing threads closer, tightening the net. That evening, as the city's lights flickered like gasping fireflies, we returned to the Royal Lyceum Theatre. Holmes had arranged to attend the rehearsal as consulting security, a fiction Mr. Hargrave was only too happy to support, given the fresh threat upon his life. The theatre was dim, echoing with the creaks and whispers of old wood and heavy curtains. The stage lights were low, casting long shadows over the chairs and orchestra pit. Holmes moved like a man surveying a battlefield, stopping now and then to examine footprints in dust, lingering hand marks on doorknobs, and scraps of torn paper caught beneath the lip of the stage. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly, pointing at a footprint near the curtain pulley, a partial sole, narrow but deep at the heel. "Someone with purpose passed this way recently. Theatre shoes do not strike the ground with such pressure. This is a different breed of visitor, urgent, and possibly armed." Before I could ask further, Lydia Marston entered from stage left with her cello, nodding briskly to us. "I take it you've seen that," she said, indicating the pinned threat Holmes now carried in his breast pocket. "Victor is on edge, as you'd expect." "As are you, Miss Marston." She gave a brittle smile. "Less than I ought to be. A cellist learns early to live with a certain proximity to danger, splintered strings, frayed nerves. Concert halls breed a special tension. Indeed, Holmes said. You've played with Hargrave for years. Have you ever known him to miss a performance? Never. Not until now. Then keep your eyes open. And should anything strike you as unusual, anything at all, I expect you to inform me immediately. She inclined her head and turned away, her silhouette vanishing behind the dark wings. As we took our seats among the empty stalls, I noticed Holmes staring toward the gallery boxes. He nodded subtly in the direction of one high above the stage. Look there, Watson. Third box from the left. A woman? Not part of the staff, I believe. Indeed, a figure sat in partial shadow, her veil drawn low, her posture unnaturally stiff. She hasn't moved since we arrived, Holmes murmured. She's watching, not the performers, but the exits. You think she's connected? I think she's watching for a mistake. Rehearsal began with a soft, aching rendition of Schubert's Rosamunde, followed by a tightly executed quartet by Mendelssohn. The musicians were skilled, but there was an undercurrent of tension that made every crescendo feel like a held breath. When the final movement of the evening's program began, Beethoven's String Quartet No. 14 in C-sharp minor, I noticed Victor Hargrave glance toward the wings more than once. His brow was damp, his fingers shaking faintly on the bow. Yet his playing, remarkably, was not affected. At the conclusion, Holmes rose. I must have a word with Bernard Quayle. We found the stage manager pacing near the trapdoor controls. You've set guards at every entrance? Holmes asked. Since this morning. No one's getting in without a pass, not even rats. Very good. Tell me, who has access to the rigging lofts? Only my team. Why? Holmes gestured toward a coil of rope lying beside the upper catwalk ladder. That loop was recently undone and retied, and not by one of your men unless your crew wears gloves made of suede. Quayle blinked. You found glove fibers. Precisely, tan suede, expensive, not the kind used for backstage work. Quayle frowned. Then someone's sneaking up there. Holmes turned to me. Watson, we shall conduct a small experiment. I want you to remain here and observe the crew. I shall return shortly. Before I could reply, he had vanished into the gloom, ascending the stairs to the upper galleries. I did as instructed, wandering among the shadows near the pit, pretending to inspect chairs and lighting. But my eyes were drawn again and again to the third gallery box, where the veiled woman remained. She had not moved. Some minutes later, Holmes returned, his boots faintly scuffed and his hair tousled from the dust. Well, I asked. Someone left a small tin up there, empty, but still redolent of oil. Lubricant used on delicate gears. For what purpose? That, he said, remains to be seen, but I suspect an automated device, perhaps a distraction, or something more sinister. Just then, a commotion erupted near the backstage corridor. Shouts echoed, followed by the unmistakable sound of a struggle. We rushed to the source, where two stagehands were restraining a young man in dark clothes and a cap.
"He was under the platform, sir," one of them shouted, "hiding behind the ropes." The man, lean and pale, thrashed violently. Holmes stepped forward and with a precise movement flicked the man's collar open to reveal a small vial strapped to his chest. "Ah," Holmes said calmly. "Chloroform." He intended to incapacitate someone, perhaps Hargrave himself. Holmes turned to the captive. "Speak, and quickly, or I shall have the police drag the truth from you." The man snarled. "You don't understand. It's not just the violin, it's what's inside it." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Go on." The man hesitated, then spat at the ground. "We were told the music would reveal it, the vibrations. That's why we warned him. That's why we took it." "We?"
But the man clammed up, and the constables, summoned in advance by Holmes, arrived to escort him out. Holmes sighed as they led the intruder away. "We are no longer dealing with simple theft, Watson. This is a conspiracy, one that reaches further than I suspected. And the violin? Still missing, but the net is closing." He looked once more to the gallery. The veiled woman was gone. Chapter 5. The Woman in the Gallery. The following morning was one of sullen greyness, the kind that paints even Baker Street in melancholic hues. Holmes stood at the window, untouched toast cooling on his plate, his eyes fixed on some invisible horizon beyond the fog. I knew better than to disturb him when he fell into such stillness, like a violin string pulled taut, silent but ready to sing at the lightest touch. Finally, he spoke. "She was not watching the concert, Watson. She was watching him." "You mean Hargrave?" "Precisely. The veiled woman in the gallery was not there for the music. She was observing Hargrave's every gesture, and when the final note was played, she vanished like smoke. And yet we still don't know who she is." Holmes turned, pacing slowly. "We do not, but I intend to. Her attire was foreign, continental. The veil was Viennese lace no longer produced, her gloves French, her scent a faint trace of hyacinth and bergamot, rare and only sold at one perfumery in London." "You plan to find her through a scent?" "I plan to find her through everything, Watson." With that, Holmes fetched his walking stick and coat and swept us both from Baker Street with barely another word. We hailed a cab and were soon headed toward the West End, weaving through streets already bustling with carriages and early shoppers. Our destination, an inconspicuous shop tucked off Bond Street, whose painted sign read "Rosette et Cie" in fading gold. Inside, the air was warm and thick with exotic fragrances. A woman with silver hair and sharp eyes greeted us. "Monsieur Holmes," she said, in a smooth French accent. "I wondered when you might arrive." Holmes smiled. "Then you'll understand why I ask. Yesterday evening, did you sell perfume to a woman in a black veil?" The woman's eyebrows lifted. "Oui, she asked for a scent discontinued years ago, Hyacinthus Royale. I still had a small bottle. She paid in sovereigns, no name." "Did she say where she was staying?" "Only that she was in London briefly. She mentioned, how do you say, an ambassador's reception tonight. She had the air of nobility." Holmes bowed. "Merci, madame." As we stepped outside, Holmes's expression sharpened. "There is to be a private diplomatic gathering this evening at the Austrian embassy. Our veiled visitor is likely among those attending, and where diplomacy and secrecy entwine, you may be sure our case is not far behind." That evening, after no small effort, Holmes secured an invitation for himself, posing as a foreign art broker, and one for me as his associate in cultural restoration. I expressed doubts about the charade, but Holmes merely adjusted my cravat and declared I looked just dubious enough to be convincing. The Austrian embassy was a splendid building near Belgrave Square, lit by gas lamps and flanked by liveried guards. Inside, an orchestra played soft waltzes, and the air shimmered with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses and the rustle of fine gowns. Holmes drifted among the guests with practiced elegance, murmuring greetings, noting details, observing. I followed at a polite distance. Within minutes, he stiffened ever so slightly and murmured, "There." At the edge of a marble corridor, the veiled woman stood alone, gazing out toward a fountain in the courtyard. Her gloved hand rested lightly on the balustrade. Holmes approached her directly. "Countess," he said softly, "you left the theatre in great haste." She did not startle. Her voice, when it came, was low and melodious. "I had seen what I came to see, Mr. Holmes." "You were watching Victor Hargrave." "I was watching what might remain of a promise made long ago." Holmes tilted his head. Then perhaps you would do better to explain what that promise was." She turned to face him fully. Her eyes, beneath the veil, were grey and keen. "My name is Countess Eliska von Dohnanyi. My grandfather was Otto Dohnanyi, Chamberlain to Archduke Rudolph. He fled Vienna in 1872, carrying something meant to be lost. A document? A confession, handwritten, political in nature, hidden within the body of a violin crafted by a secret order, loyal to the old crown." Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. "You believe that violin became Hargrave's Stradivarius?" "I know it did," she replied. "My family tracked it for decades. We lost it in the chaos of 1914, but I recognized it in Hargrave's hands last year. The sound, there is a distinct resonance only that instrument possesses. I had it once, as a child." Holmes nodded. "You were at the Lyceum to see if the music would unearth the truth?" "Yes." "And then it vanished?" "Who else knows?" Holmes asked. "A few. Those who would destroy the document. Perhaps even one of your government's enemies. I came not to steal, but to protect what remains of a country that once was." Holmes considered her words gravely. "And yet someone warned Hargrave not to play, someone tried to drug him, and now someone else, perhaps even a rival faction, has the violin." The Countess lowered her voice. "There are those who believe the document contains names, traitors who escape justice. If they're named, they will be hunted. And if it is destroyed, then the truth dies. Either way, someone wins." As we left the embassy, the snow had begun to fall in soft flakes across the pavement. Holmes walked briskly, his coat flaring behind him like a cape. "We are dealing with more than a theft, Watson," he said. "We are dancing at the edge of espionage." "Then what now?" "Now," he said, eyes gleaming, "we find the violin before it sings for the wrong ears." Chapter 6. The Tune That Betrays. The following morning dawned brittle and cold, with the sharp edge of frost lingering on the windows of Baker Street. Holmes had slept but a few hours, if at all, and he now sat curled in his armchair with his knees drawn close, puffing slowly on his pipe as he stared at a freshly unrolled street map of central London, upon which he had marked several locations in thick pencil. "Watson," he said abruptly, "tell me what all these places have in common." I leaned forward to examine the map. Circled were the Royal Lyceum Theatre, the Austrian Embassy, a private auction house in St. James's, and, curiously, a pawn shop off 7 Dials. They are all connected to our violin. Indeed, but more precisely, they all represent channels through which valuable items, especially musical ones, change hands, publicly or privately, legally or otherwise. You suspect it has been sold? Possibly, but more likely it has been offered discreetly. The sort of transaction that requires intermediaries, which brings me to our next stop, Mr. Jonas Fipple, an informant of questionable virtue, but unfailing ears. We found Mr. Fipple in his usual haunt, a disreputable cafe near Covent Garden where music hall performers mingled with gamblers and night porters. Fipple was a thin, wiry man with ink-stained cuffs and a voice like a rasped fiddle. "Gentlemen," he wheezed, "a pleasure, I'm sure. What's the flavour today, counterfeit Chopins or pilfered Paganinis?" Holmes leaned in. "A Stradivarius, late 17th century. Vanished 2 nights ago, may have been seen or heard since." Fipple squinted. "Strad, you say? There was talk. Down at McClellan's in Soho, fellow turned up at midnight, claiming to possess a specimen of priceless timbre, refused to open the case, said only those who could recognize a buried empire by ear would understand its worth." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Did he give a name?" "No name, but a signet ring, heavy gold, double-headed eagle, Eastern European make." Holmes rose at once. That's enough. Thank you, Mr. Fipple. You've just earned yourself a ticket to the opera. As we walked briskly towards Soho, I turned to Holmes. Austrian nobility? Russian, I suspect, Holmes said grimly. That crest has been used by various noble families in the former empire, one of whom, Count Grigor Malenkov, is in London this week under the guise of a cultural attaché. And he wants the violin for its contents. Or to destroy them. We must move quickly, Watson. If Malenkov has the instrument, he'll either crack it open or silence it forever. McClellan's was a dimly lit, smoke-laced establishment where whiskey and secrets were traded with equal currency. The barkeep recognized Holmes instantly and nodded him toward a private room in the back. There we found a surprise. Lydia Marston, Hargrave's cellist, sat at a low table beside a man I recognized from the embassy reception, tall, glacial, and dressed in diplomatic grey. Count Malenkov. Lydia's expression faltered at our approach. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. Miss Marston, Holmes said smoothly. Imagine our surprise. Malenkov stood, his accent thick with iron. I trust this is not an official inquiry? Hardly, Holmes replied. Only a gentleman's curiosity about a certain instrument recently mislaid. I know nothing of it, Malenkov said almost too quickly. Miss Marston and I were merely discussing compositions. Of course, Holmes said, his gaze unreadable. Tell me, Count, have you ever played a Stradivarius? Never. I prefer the piano. Then forgive me if I find it strange that your hotel suite was recently visited by a violin specialist from the East India Company. A flicker in the Count's eyes betrayed him. He turned to leave, but Holmes stepped in front of the door. The violin, Holmes said coolly. Where is it? I know nothing of... Holmes reached into his coat and produced a small tuning fork. With a sharp flick, he struck it, then held it to the table. A low hum filled the room. A beat later, a higher note sang in answer from beneath the table. Lydia gasped. Malenkov cursed. Holmes reached down and pulled aside the bench's velvet seat. Hidden beneath was a violin case, plain, worn, and unmistakable. The Vanishing Violin, Holmes murmured. Return to view. Malenkov moved suddenly, reaching for the case, but Lydia blocked him.
No! She said, voice trembling. I didn't know he had it, I swear. He said it was just a copy, a memento. Holmes held the case firmly. If this is the instrument, then the secret it contains has yet to be revealed. Malenkov's composure snapped. It will never be revealed. That parchment inside condemns men still alive, men who fund peace with blood. Better it be forgotten. Holmes turned to him coldly. And you were willing to drug, to threaten, and to steal to ensure it. Malenkov said nothing. But Holmes knew. He had heard enough. That evening, in the quiet safety of Baker Street, Holmes examined the violin carefully under gaslight. I watched as he removed the strings, loosened the chin rest, and delicately prized open the instrument's back with a luthier's blade. Inside, rolled tightly, was a sheet of brittle parchment bound in silk. He read it silently, then nodded. It is a confession, he said. Names, dates, betrayals, all committed during the final days of the Austro-Hungarian court. Enough to ruin reputations even now. What will you do with it? I shall deliver it to a neutral archive. It must be preserved, not used. History is not to be erased, but neither should it be weaponized. And the violin? Holmes smiled faintly. Tomorrow, Watson, Hargrave shall rehearse once more, and this time uninterrupted.
Chapter 7. Echoes in the Auditorium. The morning after the violin's recovery dawned calm and cold, with a crisp bite in the air that seemed to clear the city of its usual fog. In the sitting room at Baker Street, Holmes was in an unusually reflective mood. He stood by the window, the recovered violin resting in its case on the table beside him, as though it were a guest, too dignified for the warmth of the fire. He turned to me. "There is one final matter yet unresolved, Watson." I glanced up from my notes. "You mean Count Malenkov?" "No, he has returned to his embassy and under threat of diplomatic scandal will not be so bold again. No, I speak of the man behind the curtain, figuratively and literally, the person who orchestrated the entire scheme. You believe Malenkov was not the mastermind? He was a weapon, not the wielder. Think, Watson, he is a foreign agent. His motives are clear. But who told him when and where to strike? Who stood to gain by Victor Hargrave's silence and the violin's disappearance? I said nothing. Holmes continued, his voice low and measured. Miss Marston's presence with Malenkov was no coincidence, but her astonishment at discovering the violin's true identity seemed genuine. She was used, like Hargrave, like Malenkov. The web is wider than it appears. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson opened it to reveal none other than Hargrave himself, gaunt, pale, and dressed in black, yet standing upright with a strength that had eluded him days earlier. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I've come to thank you." Lydia told me everything, and I hardly know what to say. I was nearly the instrument of my own undoing. Holmes inclined his head. "The violin is safe. The secret within it shall be preserved. But tell me, Mr. Hargrave, who else knew of its provenance?" "No one," he replied. "Only Lydia and I spoke of the violin's origin, and even she only learned of the legend, not its specifics." Holmes's brow furrowed. "That is what troubles me. The theft occurred with precision. Your food was drugged, your concert sabotaged, and the violin vanished beneath the nose of every patron. That level of coordination requires insight from within, someone close, someone trusted." Hargrave's jaw tightened. "You think the saboteur was in the orchestra?" "Perhaps, or someone with access to it." At that moment, Holmes's gaze shifted suddenly to the violin case. He crossed the room swiftly, opened it, and removed the instrument with utmost delicacy. Holding it up to the light, he ran his fingers along its body. Then he smiled, a small, triumphant smile that I had come to associate with revelations. "Watson," he said, "I believe the time has come to let the violin speak." That afternoon, at Holmes's insistence, we returned to the Royal Lyceum Theatre. Hargrave was invited to rehearse on stage, while the theatre staff and orchestra members milled about in the wings, drawn by curiosity or guilt. Miss Marston arrived late, her eyes wary but warm. Holmes stood at the conductor's podium, clearly enjoying the illusion of authority, and motioned to Hargrave. "Play, if you please," he said, "and let no interruption spoil the sound." The hall filled with the first rich, resonant note from the Stradivarius. It seemed to vibrate with history. As Hargrave played, Holmes moved slowly through the wings, watching the faces around him. It was near the fourth movement of a sonata when Holmes froze, just beyond the curtains. A tall, thin man was leaning against a column, an unassuming figure I recognized as Edward Bratley, the orchestra's long-standing stage manager. He had been with the company for nearly 2 decades. Holmes approached him quietly. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Bratley looked up, surprised. "Indeed, a magnificent sound." "Pity we almost lost it," Holmes said casually. "And all because someone wanted the violin silenced." Bratley's face twitched. "You think it was deliberate?" "Oh, I don't think," Holmes replied. "I know." There was a moment of silence. Then Holmes added with deadly calm, "You slipped the powder into Hargrave's tea the night before the concert. You bribed the porter to leave the instrument unattended. You passed information to Malenkov and posed as the liaison for delivery. You did it all in exchange for a tidy sum, and perhaps for reasons of ideology. Bratley's face drained of colour. You have no proof. Holmes turned slightly. No? Then I wonder why the parchment, which I removed from the violin last night, contains not only names from Vienna, but also a signature. That of your grandfather, one Gustav Bratlovich, an informant for the Austro-Hungarian court. You had every reason to want the document destroyed. The man took a step back, eyes wide with panic. You had the opportunity, Holmes continued, advancing. You had the motive, and you had the means. You believed you were preserving your family's honor, but in truth, you were only deepening its disgrace. A cry went up from one of the orchestra members. Bratley turned to flee, but was intercepted by a pair of constables Holmes had preemptively stationed at the stage door. As he was led away, Hargrave's final note echoed through the theatre, clear, bold, and triumphant. Outside, as we strolled into the gathering dusk, Holmes lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. A satisfying harmony, wouldn't you say, Watson? Indeed, though I marvel how you suspected Bratley. He was too eager to fade into the background. Stage managers know every creak and corner of a theatre. When a crime requires silence and swiftness, it's often the one already in the shadows who knows how best to hide. And what of the Countess? She has returned to Vienna. Her family name may now find closure rather than conspiracy. And the violin? Holmes smiled faintly. Back in Hargrave's hands where it belongs. It shall sing its truth through music, not parchment. Chapter 8. The final cadence. 2 days after the arrest of Edward Bratley, Baker Street was returned to its usual rhythm, quiet but watchful. Holmes stood over a breakfast tray, poking at a slice of toast with the same surgical precision he brought to crime scenes. The violin, now restored to its rightful owner, had made headlines across London, but Holmes, as ever, cared little for public glory. I sometimes wonder, I mused aloud, if the music itself mattered more than the mystery. Holmes smiled faintly, stirring his tea. On the contrary, Watson, in this case the music was the mystery. I leaned forward. Then tell me, how did you truly piece it all together, from the concert to Bratley's betrayal? Holmes set down his cup and laced his fingers. The key, as always, lay not in what was said, but in what was unsaid. When Hargrave collapsed, the assumption was poison or fatigue, but the dosage was so mild it suggested a desire to impair, not to kill. Whoever administered it wanted him off stage, not dead. That implied planning and access. Access which Bratley possessed. Exactly. A stage manager has unfettered freedom in a theatre. He knows routines, habits, timings. Who else could have orchestrated the vanishing of a priceless instrument without attracting suspicion? But what about Count Malenkov? Surely he played a major role. Holmes nodded. Malenkov was the eager hand, but not the mind. He came to London on a diplomatic pretext, but his true mission was to secure, or destroy, the secret within the violin. His mistake was relying on a local agent without vetting their loyalties. You mean Bratley had his own reasons? Quite. The confession hidden within the violin bore the name of his grandfather, Gustav Bratlovich, implicated in a scandal that led to the exile of several Viennese officials. For Bratley, this was a matter of blood and shame. He sought to destroy the document not for money, but for legacy. I blinked. He wanted to erase history? Holmes tapped the table gently. But history, Watson, is remarkably resilient. The violin's construction, an instrument of resonance, preserved the parchment. Its value as music concealed its greater truth. I thought for a moment. And the Countess? She was the unexpected variable. She came not to steal, but to witness, to see if the violin still existed. Her presence at the theatre was the only thing that puzzled me initially. She had nothing to gain by interfering. That told me she was a guardian, not a thief. She even tried to warn Hargrave. Indeed, the note, the veiled appearance, the urgency, it all pointed to someone attempting to preserve the truth, not silence it. I glanced at Holmes. There were so many moving parts. How did you keep them straight? Holmes chuckled. With difficulty, but there were signs. The powder in Hargrave's tea bore traces of a rare sedative only used by performers. Bratley would have had access, and the pawnshop trail led not to a desperate thief, but to a careful negotiator. He wasn't selling a violin, he was testing who might pay to protect its secret. And the moment of certainty? Holmes grew thoughtful. When we were at the embassy, I noted the Countess's perfume. Subtle, refined, distinct. A scent of the past, yet Bratley reeked of varnish, resin, and oil. Not uncommon in a theatre man, but more telling was the way he flinched when the violin played. Flinched, only slightly, but it betrayed a deeper fear. The music was more than sound, it was memory. He knew what it carried. I exhaled slowly. So when Hargrave performed again, it wasn't just a rehearsal, it was bait. Holmes gave a modest shrug. An elegant trap, and when Bratley could not remain still during the sonata, I knew the music was unraveling him from within. We sat in companionable silence for a moment. Finally, I asked, "And what became of the document?" Holmes reached into the inner pocket of his dressing gown and retrieved a sealed envelope. "I made a copy," he said simply. "The original has been deposited in a secure European archive with instructions for its release in 25 years. By then, those named will likely be gone, and scholars may debate its truth without endangering lives."
And the violin? Returned to Hargrave this morning. I took the liberty of repairing a hairline fracture. Trivial, but enough to ensure it resonates as it once did. No more secrets hiding within. I laughed softly. One could almost say the case ended in perfect harmony. Holmes smirked. Only if one were inclined towards sentimental metaphors. We were interrupted by a soft knock. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes took it, read it, and raised an eyebrow. Well, what is it?" He passed it to me. It read, "Grateful beyond words. Tonight's performance dedicated to you both." VH. "Hargrave's concert?" I asked. Holmes stood and reached for his coat. "Shall we, Watson? One final performance. Let us see if music, once threatened, may now thrive." That evening we sat once more in the Royal Lyceum as Hargrave stepped onto the stage to a hushed and eager crowd. He held the Stradivarius like a sacred object, and when the first note rang out, pure, clear, and unburdened, it seemed the theatre itself held its breath.
Holmes leaned toward me, his eyes half closed. "Strange," he murmured, "to think that beneath such elegance once lay the weight of empires." "But no longer," I said. "Now it is only music." "Precisely, Watson," Holmes said, the faintest smile on his lips. "As it always should have been." And with that, the final cadence began, sweet, soaring, and free of secrets.